That's interesting. Okay. That's interesting. I mean, it was posted only 4 days earlier.
There's no question that states in Eastern Europe that were outside NATO wanted in. I don't blame Ukraine for wanting in. My point is we don't have to accept them. There's no rule that says just because somebody wants to be in NATO that we have an open door policy and we take them in.
And you didn't with Ukraine.
I actually don't believe that at all. We have actually doubled down.
They are not members of Ukraine, and no one has.
You have to let me answer the question.
Yes, sorry.
You raised a lot of excellent points, and I want to deal with them. But I think that if it's clear that the Russians view Ukraine in NATO as an existential threat, you should not admit Ukraine to NATO.
Right? That's the point. It's like, why the fuck would you do it? You know? And then what everybody could have foreseen happens, and the whole West acts like it's the biggest surprise in the world, and Putin is nothing but like an irrational Adolf Hitler, and nobody understands why he's doing it, and you know, what did I want to say? Or how would I put it? He's all in the wrong in the sense that only he is in the wrong, right? It's not, the West did nothing wrong there.
Or push to admit Ukraine.
And you know, like I watched a video the day before yesterday, you know, the one which I briefly mentioned yesterday, where which was about which was posted 7 years ago, where they about the Ukraine Russia conflict then, and that guy already said back then, you know, Putin's objective is, if you want to get Ukraine, like if you want to get Ukraine no matter the cost, you can have it, but we will destroy it. Okay? So that was already an open secret, let's say, 7 years ago. And 7 years later, you know, we continue to push things in a direction which will ultimately lead to the wreckage of Ukraine for no apparently good reason, other than what we just saw with regards to Iraq back then, which is that the US has to prove that they have a bigger dick than the rest of the world, you know? They're kind of like, they're like children, like tyrannical children who cannot tolerate other people or nations dominating them. They have to be on top no matter what. So it's like they didn't get Crimea, oh no, we have to prove that our dick is bigger. No, or else we lose.
To NATO, because the end result is what you have today. We, in effect, pursued a policy that is leading to the destruction of Ukraine. If we had not attempted to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border, with NATO expansion, EU expansion, and the color revolution, but especially NATO expansion, there'd be, in all likelihood, no war in Ukraine today. Crimea would still be part of Ukraine, and certainly those 4 oblasts that the Russians annexed would be part of Ukraine. But I just want to go back to a couple points that Carl raised. First of all, I've gone over in great detail every one of Putin's speeches, press conferences, and his writings. And the argument that he was bent on incorporating Ukraine into Russia is usually said to be outlined in a famous article that he wrote on July 12th, 2021. You can easily find this article on the internet. And he did say many of the things that Carl said about how it was regrettable, how Lenin set up the Soviet Union, and so forth and so on. He does not say in that paper that he is interested in conquering Ukraine.
And that's just another great example of Western disinformation propaganda, right?
That it's desirable to conquer Ukraine.
So like you have to wonder if you have to use lies to justify a war, because that is what the West is doing. Is that war actually justified? And I think that the answer is obvious.
In fact, if you go look at the article, and this is the article that almost everybody points to, you should go read it. He says that he recognizes Ukrainian nationalism. He says that he recognizes Ukrainian independence, and he says that the future of Ukraine is up to the Ukrainian people. That's what he says in the article that everybody points to is the key piece of evidence that he was out to conquer Ukraine. As I said to you before, I can find no evidence that he thought he could conquer Ukraine. Just a word or two about capabilities.
Right, and that's also like the funny, interesting thing. Like, I can't really blame the West on censoring RT, because Russia does the same with Western media. But that is where a censorship of freedom of speech leads, ultimately. It only leads to disinformation, propaganda, and dictatorship, and so on and so forth, Because if we had access to RT, I'm pretty sure this would be conventional knowledge. But because it's not any Western disinformation agents and government provocateurs and media outlets and so on and so forth can spew this propaganda and warmongering justification without any consequences or backlash, because they know that 99% of the people will take their sources at their word without looking that shit up themselves, especially if it suits them, right?
1,000 troops. It was.
And I don't want to argue that I am much different from that in that respect, even though I try to be careful and also careful with who I trust, but obviously also fallible, like
almost all of his army, as Carl pointed out. You're not going to conquer a piece of real estate as large as Ukraine with an army that small. And he might have dropped bombs on Western Ukraine, but you can't conquer and occupy a country with bombs. You need ground forces to do that. He didn't have the ground forces. He never even attempted to conquer one half of the country. At most, he attempted to conquer one-third of the country.
And those things that he says, are the same things that Gonzalo Lida has said in his video, The Ukraine Conflict, the Primer, that Putin is not an expansionist and imperialist. Maybe he is that to some extent, but he is not that in the same way as any Westerner, frankly, by now purports. That was not his initial goal or objective.
Country. He just didn't have the capability. This was not the Wehrmacht. Even with regard to Kiev, he could not have conquered Kiev with the forces that he had. It was just too small an army. He wanted to threaten Kiev, but he couldn't conquer it.
Right, and that's also exactly what Gonzalo said. You know, he didn't actually attempt to get Kiev. What he wanted, or what he did, was to use a scare tactic in order, what he also did numerous times before, in order to get the Minsk agreement enforced like it was supposed to. But the Ukrainians and the Americans never did that. Even though, as far as I know, they agreed to the Minsk agreement, they hadn't done what they were supposed to and said they would, which is to leave Crimea to the Russians, for example. And also, it shows you, you know, ultimately, I think the question of whether the United States can actually be trusted, you know, and with the United States, I mean the government and military and clandestine agencies, is by now it's practically redundant to ask. And so yeah, that's what he said. You know, so now I have another credible source which underlines or affirms or confirms another thing which he said in that video, which he went into prison for, in which he got tortured and is now in prison again. And so far it looks as if for telling the truth.
Now, just one final point, and then I'll turn it back to you, Cecilia.
But you know, like, who is surprised about that anymore? Look at Julian Assange, for example, right? How he is tortured. Not in the same way, but through isolation and if I'm not mistaken, solitary confinement, so on and so forth, right? And he did nothing wrong as far as I know. He was simply a whistleblower. And in our Western democracies, what needs to happen for these democracies to actually function is to allow for whistleblowers, at the very least. But instead what we do is we torture them. Which is why we're in this mess that we're in right now.
Carl said that if you look at what happened over the past few decades, it's a case of the East moving West and not the West moving East. I don't know how you could make that argument with NATO expansion. Of course it's the West moving East. NATO expansion, EU expansion, the color revolutions, where were the Russians moving westward? The Russians weren't capable of launching a military offensive in the 1990s. They were so weak, and then Putin comes to power in 2000, and over time he resurrects the Russians. He brings them back from the dead, but they don't have the military capability to go on the offensive. As you know, in the August 2008 military campaign in Georgia, the Russian army performed terribly. Right? They just don't have the military capability. There's no evidence that the East is moving west. It's the West that's moving east. And this is what presents an existential threat to the Russians.
But what about if you go back to 2007? That is when Putin, in his speech in Munich, announced that in his view, the multipolar world was already arriving. Now, in your presentation, you said 2017. That is 10 years later. So isn't it a possibility that Putin, from
I
that
really
moment
like
on,
the layout of this video. By the way, it's very unconventional, but it's very original still and pleasing to watch.
that in mind as he goes forward from 2008 and then interprets things
No,
differently?
The famous Munich speech in 2007 that Cecilia is referencing is where Putin first makes it manifestly clear that he is angry at the West for their policies, which he thinks do not take into account Russian interests. But he does not indicate that he's going to rectify this problem by going on the offensive and attacking any country in the world. What sets off the real trouble is the April 2008 decision at
Right, and
Bucharest.
that's another problem. You know what is, if I, as far as I understand or perceive this, is, you know, the what can be the problem therein, and I'm not making the argument that it would be any different if Russia or if China was the superpower. In fact, I think that it might have even been worse. Thing is, I'm not competent or educated enough to make those statements indefinitely, definitively, but you know, like, as far as my competence reaches, I can imagine that, you know, such things could be or would be worse if those states were the actual superpowers. But what, you know, as it stands, for whatever reasons there are, as far as I know, they're not acting in the same manner precisely, and which would make sense from a psychological perspective, you know. And what he's laying out there, or what Putin meant by that, as far as if I understand correctly, is what I also read recently by the paper that the Chinese government has put out, their statement on the USA, is that the USA has had a policy with which they approach foreign nations, which is that they're either their allies or their, which is either alliance or confrontation. So it's an either you're with us or against us kind of policy that the Americans had been pushing. And well, the problem with that kind of policy is that you create a lot of enemies, you know. And again, I'm not exactly competent in this area, but my impression is that the African nations are not exactly good-willed towards America. And who the fuck would be surprised, right? It's like, yeah, that's what you get by being the bully and by underestimating the weak and so on and so forth.
NATO summit at Bucharest, April 2008, where NATO says at the end of that summit that Georgia and Ukraine will become part of NATO. It's no accident, ladies and gentlemen, that on August 2000...
I wonder right now if you can... Okay, you can hear me, okay. I wonder if I should get rid of this chat box window, but it's a bit late for that if you ask me. So I'm just gonna leave it there for now.
In August 2008, you had a war in Georgia, and then starting on February 22nd, 2014, conflict broke out in Ukraine, right? That's what was driving the train here. And by the way, just one final point before I turn it to Carl. Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy were adamantly opposed to bringing Ukraine into NATO at the April 2008 Bucharest summit. And Angela Merkel has recently said that the reason she opposed bringing Ukraine into NATO is that she understood, listen to these words, she understood.
But the US doesn't give a fuck about that, because in their mind they're playing poker, and they have the better cards, and they have more chips, so they can take the risk, and to them it's a winning game.
That Putin would interpret it as a declaration of war against Russia. That's in April 2008. But what did the Americans do? The Americans steamrolled her, and they steamrolled Sarkozy. And they kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And it all blew up in their face on February 24th of this year.
Your reaction to this, Bill?
Pure fantasy. I can agree with you, John, that sort of the Bucharest meeting was fairly muddled. There were the then president of Ukraine, the then president of Georgia who wanted in, and most people said no. And then as a compromise they had that particular language. But they refused them even a membership action plan. And you need unanimity in NATO. And since then, there's not been a single NATO meeting where there's been a serious discussion about membership. And even, I would say, even a half-dead second secretary of a Russian embassy in any NATO country would be able to report back that that was off the table for the foreseeable future. Off the table for the foreseeable future. What caused the big problem in 2013 and 2014, and I was there, was the fact that Ukraine wanted to have a free trade agreement with the European Union. And it was the Ukrainians who wanted it. They were knocking on the EU door time after time after time. Not everyone in the EU was enthusiastic, but evidently that was given. And then Putin said this is utterly unacceptable, forced President Yanukovych with the most brutal means to go back on that. That caused the people of Ukraine to go to the square in Maidan waving, they didn't wave American flags, sorry to say, they waved the EU flags on the Maidan and say, we want to be part of this. And why? Not because they were anti-Russian.
But part of this was caused by the Americans.
That was not an issue at the moment. They saw the success of Poland, for example, having done the democratic reforms and having done the economic reforms and having a substantially better economic and social and political development than Ukraine had. No question, they wanted to go the same way. And Ukraine happens, and that's fairly important to understand, Ukraine is a democracy. They have elections. They express their will to go, in this particular case, west. On going west and east is not moving geography. I agree with that. Geography doesn't move. But in political terms, they wanted to go west. Poland wanted to go west into NATO. Ukraine wanted to go west into the EU, as the Baltic states did. They wanted to go away from the east, which they associated with authoritarian and failed and repressive regimes in Russia. And that, I think, and there I can agree with you, I think Putin does see that as an existential threat. I think he does see a successful, democratic, big Ukraine as an existential threat, not to Russia, but to the sort of Russian regime that he represents. And he's been abundantly clear in saying that what is called colored revolutions, people waving European flags, people waving flags of others, people who wanted democracy, people who wanted to be able to elect their governments. He's been abundantly clear that he sees that as an existential threat to his Russian regime. In that particular sense, he's right.
So I'm very interested in the opposition of this dude, because I think he's bringing up very good arguments. And he's certainly bringing some nuance back into the discussion as far as I can tell. But I'm also interested in hearing or clarifying the accuracy of what he purports.
Let me make two sets of responses to what Carl said. He makes the argument, which many people make, that there was really no chance that Ukraine would become part of NATO, and that we have sort of given up on that. I believe that's simply not true. And in June of 2021, NATO's conference was held in Brussels. In an official statement released by NATO, they said that they were reinvigorating their commitment to bring Ukraine into NATO. On November 10th, 2021, the United States and Ukraine issued a white paper laying out the strategic relationship between the United States and Ukraine, where we made it unequivocally clear we were committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. Furthermore, we were arming and training the Ukrainians so that they were effectively becoming a de facto member of NATO. Many people wonder why the Ukrainians have done so well against the Russians on the battlefield. And they say it's because the Russians are incompetent, period, end of story. That's half of the story. The other...
Yeah, and that's also something what, like, my impression has been what you have to give to the Americans, though, is that, you know, by now they're really good at war. So sometimes you can't blame the Americans for thinking, well, then, you know, let's wave our dick around because something we gotta do with all this power, otherwise it's wasted value. But it's not just a dangerous game, but it's a fucking irresponsible game, and it's a fucking psychopathic game.
The other half is that the Ukrainians were a formidable fighting force, and they were a formidable fighting force because we were training 10,000 Ukrainian troops per year from 2014 to 2024. And we were arming the Ukrainians. President Zelensky and his defense minister today refer to Ukraine as a de facto member of NATO. It was becoming a de facto member of NATO, in fact, and then in principle, we remain committed to bringing it into the alliance. Now, okay, go ahead. No, let me make
It is also like a very classic manipulative trick, right? You just don't make it explicit. It's just also something that the USA has been doing. I'm not sure about whether it's limited to the USA, but it's clear that it's something that the USA has been doing, you know, to no small amount.
Quick point, just on another issue that Carl raised. Carl raised the point that the Russians viewed Ukraine becoming a liberal democracy as a serious threat, and you said you agreed with me on that. The point I want to make is that NATO, mainly the United States, was pursuing a three-pronged strategy. I tried to make that clear in my formal presentation. NATO expansion, EU expansion, and turning Ukraine into a liberal democracy. So it's important to understand that that third strand that Carl was talking about, where he and I agree, that third strand is inextricably linked to the second strand and the first strand.
Yeah, and that's I think an interesting point, because well, that other dude has said in the other video is that, you know, like, one of the policies which the USA had been pursuing over the world is to turn countries into democracies, not only because they love democracy, because it's probably not about that, to be honest, but because, you know, they view democracies as inherently pro-US. and can't fault them for thinking that way. And so you can also imagine that the first step, and that's again a referral to the Color Revolution, and the first step that the USA would conduct in any sort of manner is to influence and manipulate a country more and more and more and more into a Western democracy. Suddenly, if that's, if they want to go all the way, that's how they start. And by the way, though, I'm not thinking that Putin has been doing it, wanted to do it any differently, because all of them have the influence campaigns, right?
In the minds of the Russians. So when he...
But in my opinion, it speaks of a fatal flaw in the system, which is that the system is not built upon truth. The global war system is built upon secrecy and lies. So it's basically built around the axis of evil. And if you want to do things right from like a war and international politics perspective, in my opinion, you have to reform the systems to be aligned with the truth, to be honest. And now I don't want to be naive, and you will always need secret services and you will always use disruptive tactics against your enemies and so on and so forth. But if the US wouldn't have so much shit on their shoes, then they would be able to more resort to strategies which would revolve around disclosing the truth and exposing the enemies instead of doing the same things, only worse,
Well, yeah. Go ahead.
Now, in the minds of Putin, don't say that Putin and the Russians are necessarily the same things. I've been involved with Russia intensely since the early 90s. I made a lot of friends. I worked very closely together with two Russian foreign ministers I still consider my friends, and one of them I'm still in contact with. And in the Balkans, we work constructively with them. I have to say that all of my friends from those years are either dead, killed, murdered, in prison, or outside of Russia. But those were Russians that wanted the same thing as the Ukrainians. They wanted constitutional government in their country. They wanted sort of decent living standards. They wanted free speech. They wanted some sort of democracy. Might not have been Swedish standards. But Putin has a security regime that is different. And he has faced demonstrations in Russia that he fights with violence after he returned to power, and he's seen colored revolutions as a threat against his regime. That's why I'm saying, in that particular aspect, he's right. He considers the colored revolutions, democracy in other parts of the former Soviet Union, as a threat to his regime. But that, to be precise, it's not something that invented by me or by American politicians. That is demands coming from the people in these countries themselves. Democracy, it's called.
Can I?
But Paul, can I just quick go back?
Oh, yeah.
I just want to. I hope you don't mind us going back and
good.
forth, but
Okay.
I mean this
Go ahead.
fits
Go
together
ahead.
neatly. I think that if you talk about Russian elites regarding the issue that we're talking about tonight, the question is, how do the Russian elites think about bringing Ukraine into NATO? And you might think from listening to Carl talk that
Subs
there's
are really
disagreement among the Russian elites.
really,
I do not believe that's the case. And Bill
off the
Burns,
charts.
who is now the head of the CIA, he's now the head of the CIA, and he was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow at the time of the Bucharest NATO summit in April 2008, wrote a famous memo to Condoleezza Rice, where he said, for the entire Russian elite, not just Putin, Ukraine in NATO is the brightest of red lines. He said, I've talked to all of the knuckle draggers in the depths of the Kremlin. And he said, I've talked to Putin's most ardent liberal critics, and they all agree to a person that Ukraine in NATO is unacceptable. So on that particular issue, which is the issue on the table this evening, there is unanimity. This is why, Carl, I would say that, you know, if Putin is overthrown, you're not going to get somebody in there who is interested in cutting a deal and living with Ukraine and NATO. You'll get somebody who's probably more hawkish than Ukraine, or at least as hawkish.
But where is
That's
the
kind of the
Ukrainian
problem
people?
I've had with the other dissension, which is that even though it seems relevant to bring up, it seemed to be a logical fallacy in response to, you know, what Mersheimer was saying.
In your analysis, because the Ukrainian population in 2014 was divided on the issue, but as a result of what has happened in Ukraine over the past 8 years, more and more Ukrainians, also Russian-speaking Ukrainians, are kind of rallying around Kiev. And from February of this year, when the invasion took place, a number of powerful Ukrainians who have been more likely to support Moscow rallied around the flag.
But why, though, is what I would wonder right now, because I can't see how, you know, as infested as Ukraine is with U.S. lobbyists and propagandists and you know, intelligence, how that would not be a development which was pushed forward to no insignificant extent by the Americans. Because, for example, what the Ukraine had been doing is shelling part of the eastern Ukrainian population, right? So, and, well, I don't know, maybe I don't know enough about the other side of the story, but like, what has been going on, I wonder, you know, to that extent, in that conflict in those years, which would unite Ukrainians in opposition to Russia, let's say. You know, maybe maybe the answer is simple, which is that, you know, Russia is invading Ukraine, but what Ukraine doesn't see or didn't see apparently is that America has been invading Ukraine too. You know, it's the same with Crimea. It's like, and I have some sympathy for that, you know, like I don't want to say, because like both parties acted very, you know, both parties act, or maybe the better way to say is that, you know, which political party in the world does not act disgraceful in some manner, but how I had perceived Russia to be, in my, let's say, amateurish perception, is that they are more open and direct in their confrontational methods than the US, for example, is, you know, because the US is, in my opinion, is sly. and disgusting. And I'm pretty sure the Russians have been doing things which I would find unacceptable. Would probably be an understatement if I imagine all the torture which happened, which play out in my imagination as having been conducted by the Russians. But even then, Russia seems to be more direct and confrontational, which is just from like a character perspective, or maybe simply at the end of the day seems to be a better, even if still wrong, that kind of tendency seems to be a more righteous approach than doing things in a manipulative, cunning, deceptive, deceitful, sly manner.
How do you explain that?
Well, anytime a foreign country invades your country, you're going to have a rally around the flag effect. Nationalism is going to kick in big time. I think there's no question that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has fueled Ukrainian nationalism, and it has brought the Ukrainian people together. I wouldn't deny that for 1 second.
But didn't Putin take that into account?
Yes, I'm sure he did.
How?
Look, Putin felt for certain that he was in a desperate situation. I mean, invading Ukraine is a matter of huge consequence. You just don't do that lightly. You have to feel that there is a serious security threat, because you might not know to what extent the United
Well, I don't like. I can't say for certain, right? But it's not obvious to me that Russia is also not simply playing this, dick measurement game like the US is.
United States and its European allies are going to come into the fight, but you know the United States is likely to come into the fight. You know how powerful the United States is.
Shit.
Putin was fully aware, you can document this, that the Ukrainians were being armed and trained by the West and were reasonably formidable. So for him to do that, he had to be desperate. This is my point about using nuclear weapons. You do not want to underestimate the risks that great powers are willing to take when they are desperate. And I believe that his attack against Ukraine on February 24th was an act of desperation. It was not an attempt to create a Russian empire.
Because in an interview in the New Yorker in February, you said that in your view, Putin was not going to try to build a greater Russia. He was not interested in conquering and integrating Ukraine into Russia. You suggested that we invented the story that Putin is aggressive and responsible for the situation. Now then, in November, you said, Putin's goals have escalated since the war started on February 24th, and he is now interested in conquering territory by annexing 4 oblasts in the east. Now, most analysts believe the opposite is the case, that Putin's goals were much more ambitious at the outset of the war, but he failed time and time again. The Ukrainian pushback took the Russians by surprise. The closing of ranks in Europe and NATO has been unprecedented since 2001. And how do you explain that a war has gone so badly for Russia has led Putin to escalate his goals?
Look, there's no question that when a war breaks out, and I could walk you through some of the big wars of history, that you get escalation in terms of goals, and you get escalation in terms of the means or the strategies or the weaponry that's used. I mean, you could get nuclear escalation. You get an escalation now where the Russians are attacking the electrical grid in Ukraine. So there has been significant escalation in terms of means, and there has been significant escalation in terms of Russian goals. The question on the table that we've been debating up to now is, what were Russian goals before the war? And as I'm arguing throughout the evening, There is no evidence that the Russians were bent on conquering territory. The Russians went to great lengths to make the Minsk II framework work because the Russians did not want the Donbass. They wanted a Minsk II solution. It's when the Minsk II solution clearly had failed by February of this year that he invaded.